Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Knife Chats with Tobias. Hi everybody, Tobias here, and today I thought I'd talk about another fixed blade, and this time it's going to be this one. It's pretty famous. It is the Mark I, USN Mark I deck knife. At least that's usually what it is referred to as, a deck knife. I believe it is also known as a utility knife. In any case, there's a lot of interesting facts about this knife. And also, when it comes to the knife collector, there's a surprising amount of varieties of this knife that you can actually pick up, and they are all still official United States Navy Mark I deck knives. It's not like Mark I A1, Mark I, anything like that. They're all just a Mark I deck knife, regardless of the little differences between them. The reason I'm showing this one first is because the handle on this one is almost exactly what the United States Navy asked for in the original contract. This blade originally would have been correct as well. Unfortunately, there's about a ½ inch missing on the tip of this blade, and the clip would have not been quite as dramatic as you see on this knife. That's because I have a feeling that it was broken at one time and somebody reprofiled it. It isn't even a sharp tip. The original one had a sharp tip, which is interesting because this knife, which is a Mark I deck knife for the United States Navy that came out around 1942, 1943, this was the very first fixed blade knife adopted by the United States Navy. Up until World War II, the United States Navy had never adopted a fixed blade knife, at least not officially. That's not to say that you would never find a fixed blade knife on a United States Navy vessel going all the way back to 1775. That would be a bunch of bunk. What I'm saying is they had never had an official fixed blade knife that was approved by the Department of Navy. Now, a captain of a ship might have allowed fixed blade knives, something like that, even during World War I. However, this was the first knife officially adopted by the United States Navy. First fixed blade knife adopted by the United States Navy. They had folding knives, official folding knives adopted by the United States Navy as early as the Civil War. But not a fixed blade, not an official fixed blade that was Navy-wide until this knife came out, the Mark I. So that is something kind of special about these knives. And the original specifications for the knife called for a 5 1/8 inch clip point blade, not a sheep foot or anything like that. They called for a clip point blade on the Navy knife, which was unusual at the time because, if you notice, most Navy knives, most rigging knives and everything have a sheep foot blade, but the United States Navy, they wanted something pointy, and for good reason, because it was going to be a utility knife that was going to be used by a variety of people, including, I believe these might have been a knife that was going to be going to aviators and air crew and a few other places too, as well as, just crew on the Navy decks. So the other thing besides the 5 1/8 inch blade, it had a half guard. That's what the Navy originally called for, a half guard on the knife. And then it would have a stacked leather handle. And then it would have the railroad spike pommel on the back end here. And the pommel is there. They called for an aluminum pommel at the time, a steel guard, and obviously a steel blade, and the stacked leather handle with the tang running through the entire length, and it was supposed to be pinned to the guard. Okay, I got this part backwards. The Navy wanted a screw nut holding the pommel to the knife, not a pin passing through the tang. And this knife is actually by PAL, the RH-35. The RH-35 began life with Remington as the RH-35, and it was a Remington hunting knife that had the 5 1/8 inch blade. So basically, what the United States Navy wanted was the Remington RH-35. They were adopting that hunting knife for their deck knife. And this was the official knife that was adopted for the United States Navy. This is the first one. Like I said, though, the blade was a little bit different. The blade was closer to this, and this is a sheath. I'll talk about the sheath in a minute. The blade on them looked closer to this. Now, this one is by Camillus, and we can see the difference here. You notice the false edge going up here. I'm sorry, swedge up here. It's not a false edge, but you do have some that have a false edge. For those who don't know the difference between a swedge and a false edge, a swedge is not sharpened. A false edge has a cutting edge. It's a term pulled over from the world of swords. And you notice here that you have it's more of a saber grind going here instead of a full flat grind. I believe they were looking for a full flat grind on the knife. I don't know 100%. Have to go back and look at all the notes. And I've also read conflicting things of exactly the way the blade was supposed to look. But almost everyone agrees that the RH-35 was the one that was closest to what the Navy had originally contracted for. Notice this one also says USN Mark I. However, this one was made by Camillus in New York. Still has the leather grip, stacked leather grip. But interesting enough, this one, as you can see, does have the screw cap or the screw nut on the bottom here to hold the pommel in place. And that black pommel is actually plastic. And the reason that came out like that is because originally they called for an aluminum pommel, but aluminum is used in aircraft. So it's like, that was a war shortage material. So the Navy almost immediately said, well, it'd be nice if it had aluminum. So if it doesn't have aluminum, that's okay. So you find these with from other companies that have a wood pommel. You see some with a steel pommel. You see a lot of them with plastic pommels, and you see quite a few with the aluminum pommels as well. But if you notice, it still has that railroad spike shape to the pommel. Also of note here is this one has a full guard. The Camillus version came out with a full guard. The Navy didn't really care too much one way or the other how that guard was. Full guard, half guard, it really didn't matter. As long as that blade was about 5 1/8 inches long, you will see them as short as 4 3/4 inches all the way out to like 5 1/4, 5 3/8 inches, depending on the manufacturer of the knife. It was like that length was close enough. If it was around 5 1/8 inches long, the Navy adopted it. It was that simple. And if it had a pommel similar to this, it was good enough. And what you will see with all of them, though, is they are actually stamped USN Mark I, regardless of the manufacturer. And there's like 12 or 14 companies that were putting these out, and all of them are slightly different. And that's why it's kind of an interesting pattern to collect, the U.S. Navy Mark I Navy knife. Now, one of them that you can get today is this one here. This is a reproduction that is being made currently by Colonial. The original Colonials have a very interesting story as well. Now, this is like I said, this is a reproduction one, and it comes with a nice leather sheath and stuff. This sheath is not quite the way it would have been at that time. And the interesting thing is the Navy contracted with a company for sheaths, and the leather sheaths changed a couple times, even with the Navy back in World War II. But the Navy wasn't too crazy about the leather sheaths. The problem was, flimsy at the bottom. You could actually poke through it and stuff like that, and leather and seawater just doesn't really mix too well. So there were some serious issues with a leather sheath with the Navy. And so the Navy quickly pushed for this sheath, which was actually more expensive to make than a leather sheath. And this is the one with the plastic scabbard, and you have the steel throat up at the top here, and then the webbing here. Notice there's no hanger, there's no web belt hanger. It's just webbing material with a brass snap, and then the reinforcement tips on here that are also brass, and then I believe these are brass too, the brass rivets holding the webbing onto the throat of the scabbard. So this is the sheath that was adopted, I believe, in 1943, which lines up nicely with this knife. While you see the reproductions of this knife with a leather sheath, most of the colonial knives actually came out in this type of scabbard during World War II. Okay, now, as I said, this is a reproduction, and you'll see here that on the back side of this reproduction, it just says USN. And on this side, you see Colonial Providence, Rhode Island. While the markings are close, they are not what you would see on a knife from World War II. And the blades, they came, mostly they would have been Parkerized, so that is similar to what you have here. And it was I believe a 1095 carbon steel blade back then. The interesting thing here is, if you notice, this has a plastic handle. The entire handle is molded plastic, including the pommel. Everything here is molded. Surprising enough, when Colonial first made this knife, it just kind of sat there, and no one was really interested in it. And the first people to actually look at it were not the Navy. It was actually the Army. The United States Army looked at it first. My feeling is the Army was not looking at this knife. What I've read is the Army wasn't looking at the knife because of the blade, but I have a feeling they might have been looking at it as a full package, as it is right here, for the air crew, the Army Air Force air crews. That one might have been a reason to have this knife. Also for rear echelon people, this would have been a decent enough knife for rear echelon people, but not for frontline troops. And what they were looking at mostly, though, was the plastic handle and the way the handle was attached to the knife, because they were also looking at something to replace the leather, and it looked like this might be a less expensive alternative to the leather, and it might have been a more durable alternative than the stacked leather handles. At the time, the leather, especially in 42, 43, it was not mildew resistant yet. They hadn't come up with a process to make the leather mildew resistant, so the leather handles were rotting fairly quickly. And they just weren't holding up in combat, basically. So they were looking for something like this, a rubber handle, and later they end up adopting a black plastic handle for their bayonets bayonets around 1954-55. So eventually the Army does adopt a plastic handle on their bayonets and stuff. But in any case, the Army looked at it, and what they're really concerned with is how is the blade held in place, and is the blade going to come apart? And they ran numerous tests on this, and they all the way from the point of can you freeze it, can you boil it, things of that nature. So what extreme temperatures could it go from? So, and this was going from sub-0 degrees Fahrenheit to boiling, and seeing if it did any damage to the handle. And the handle held up quite well, but for some reason the Army did not adopt it. But after the Army had gone through all that, the Navy looked at it, contacted Colonial, and said, hey, we'll take them. And so they got some of the knives. The very first ones were, as you see right here. Notice it's just slabs of plastic on the blade, you know, wrapped around the tang. And the first thing that the Navy noticed about it was it's a little blade heavy, and so they contacted Colonial and said, "Can you make the pommel a little heavier?" So what Colonial did was they came out with a second version of the knife, in which they basically cut a hole here and then they poured lead into the back of it, capped it off, and then the pommel was heavier and it worked a little bit better. They liked it a little bit better. It had a better balance and everything. But there were still some problems with that because the lead, drilling this out, putting in the lead and everything, made the knife a little more expensive to make, which was counterproductive. So what they ended up doing is making a larger plastic pommel on the knife. Finally, that's the third version of it that you'll see. So there's actually 3 different versions of this Colonial knife. The one that they made the reproduction of was the very first one, which has the smaller pommel, which is not quite the same as what you see on these, if you notice. It isn't quite the same as what you see in the as a railroad spike. This is more like a mushroom, a pommel, as opposed to the railroad spike. But it was accepted. This was a knife that the Navy, actually, when they started looking at it, they wanted it in a plastic handle and all. But typically, when you found them, they would have been in this sheath, the Mark I sheath, with the Mark I plastic sheath. So this is the way you would have seen it in World War II, with this plastic handle and everything, starting around 44, 45. I think that's when they finally started coming out. And they continued in use in the Navy even after World War II. And also the other thing about these knives is, even though the Navy had adopted the Mark II utility knife, hold on a second. This is the Mark II utility knife, you know, the Marine K-bar, if you want to call it that. But even though the Navy adopted this knife around 1942, 43, and they started having quite a few of them made, around 1 million of them, they were still making this knife right alongside of it. And that's because this knife was still cheap, easy to produce, and easier to get to than these. And these knives, it was more important to get this knife to personnel that were going to see combat or something of that nature. You know, the ones who were going to actually be in more danger. Whereas this knife was a lot lighter. It is much lighter than this, simply because a 5 1/8 inch 1095 steel blade versus a 7-inch blade, 5-inch handle, 4.5-inch handle. This one is extremely light with plastic. This one is still lighter than this, even with the stacked leather and the aluminum pommel. So that was why. And these were quite popular. And also, another interesting thing about these is when it comes to World War II knives, you know, fighting knives, these almost always will be marked Mark I. So you know it was a United States Navy Mark I knife. And they're typically less expensive than something like the Mark IIs out there, and definitely a lot less expensive than the M3 trench knives that are out there. So if you're on a budget, you might want to consider looking for these. And there is a wide variety of them. So the one thing I would suggest is doing a little research before you start buying them. But really the thing that you will notice is there's a lot of them out there that you're going to look at and you're going to go, that's got to be a fake. And then when you do the research, you go, no, that's exactly the way it's supposed to be. Who would have thought a plastic pommel on a knife, on a fighting knife, well, a deck knife, a utility knife, but yeah, just a plastic pommel and a screw nut holding it in place. And that's the way Camillus did it. But this is the way it was supposed to have been done. Too bad about the blade, though. Anyway, thought I'd talk to you a little bit about those, and hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you again soon. Let me take just a second to thank you once again for dropping by and spending a few minutes here at Knife Chats with Tobias. I really do appreciate it, and I do appreciate any comments that you leave. So please remember to give me that thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode is up and running. Thanks again for dropping by. Really do appreciate your time here.